Tonight, as the world around you becomes quieter, we are going to travel across an ancient sea. It is a sea filled with distant islands, forgotten kingdoms, mysterious caves, gentle winds, and stars reflected upon dark water. Our journey begins after one of the most famous wars in Greek mythology. The city of Troy has fallen. Its high walls have been broken. Its towers have gone silent. The armies that fought beneath those walls are finally preparing to return home. But for one Greek king, the journey home will become longer than the war itself. His name is Odysseus. He is the king of a small, rocky island called Ithaca. He has a wife named Penelope. He has a son named Telemachus. And when he first sailed away to fight at Troy, his son was still a baby. Odysseus believes that once the war is over, he will simply cross the sea and return to the people he loves. He does not know that 10 more years of wandering lie ahead of him. He does not know that storms, monsters, enchantments, gods, and his own mistakes will carry him farther and farther from home. And back in Ithaca, Penelope and Telemachus do not know whether he is alive or dead. So settle comfortably. Let your breathing become slower. Allow the sound of the sea to carry away the noise of the day. There is nowhere else you need to be. Nothing else you need to solve. Tonight, we will follow Odysseus across the ancient world. We will visit the quiet halls of Ithaca. We will enter the cave of the Cyclops. We will walk through the palace of Circe. We will pass the island of the Sirens. And eventually, after many years beneath unfamiliar skies, we will return home. Before our journey begins, you may gently support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. And perhaps, before you fall asleep, leave a comment telling us which ancient myth you would like to hear next. Now close your eyes. Take one slow breath in and let it go. The ships are leaving Troy. The sails are rising. The long journey home has begun. Story 1. The House That Waited. Far across the sea from Troy stood the island kingdom of Ithaca. It was not the richest kingdom in Greece. It did not have wide golden plains or enormous cities. Ithaca was a rugged place of steep hills, olive trees, stone paths, and small harbors hidden between cliffs. But to Odysseus, it was the most beautiful place in the world. His palace stood above the countryside, overlooking the distant sea. Inside that palace lived Penelope, his wife. For many years she had waited for him. At first, she waited through the war. Each season brought new rumors. One traveler would say that the Greeks were winning. Another would say that Troy could never be conquered. Merchants carried stories from distant ports, but no one could tell Penelope when her husband would return. Then, at last, news came that Troy had fallen. The war was over. Greek ships were sailing home. Throughout the islands, families gathered near the shore to welcome fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. But Odysseus did not return. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. The horizon remained empty. Penelope continued to wait. Their son, Telemachus, grew from a baby into a young man. He knew his father mostly through stories. Older servants told him that Odysseus had been clever, brave, and patient. They described how he could speak calmly during an argument and how he could find solutions when stronger men had failed. But stories were not the same as memories. Telemachus had no clear memory of his father's face. He sometimes imagined Odysseus walking through the palace doors. In his imagination, everyone recognized him immediately. Penelope would run toward him. The servants would celebrate. The halls would be filled with music. But every imagined return ended when Telemachus opened his eyes. The doorway remained empty. As the years passed, powerful men from Ithaca and the neighboring islands began arriving at the palace. They claimed that Odysseus must be dead. They told Penelope that she could not wait forever. According to them, Ithaca needed a king. Penelope needed a husband, and one of them should be chosen. These men became known as the suitors. At first, only a few came. Then others arrived. Soon, more than 100 suitors were gathering inside Odysseus's home. They ate his food. They drank his wine. They ordered his servants around. Every day, they sat at long tables inside the palace, laughing and arguing over which of them Penelope would eventually choose. They behaved less like guests and more like men who already owned the kingdom. Telemachus hated them, but he was young, and each suitor belonged to an influential family. If Telemachus attacked one of them, the others might unite against him. If he ordered them to leave, they simply laughed. And so the Prince of Ithaca became almost like a stranger in his own home. Penelope understood the danger. She also understood that openly refusing the suitors forever might lead to violence. So she used patience and intelligence. She announced that she would choose a new husband after she finished weaving a burial cloth for Laertes, the elderly father of Odysseus. The suitors accepted this condition. Every day, Penelope sat at her loom. The threads slowly became a great and carefully designed cloth. The suitors watched it growing and believed that the day of her decision was approaching. But each night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Penelope returned to the loom. By the light of a small lamp, she secretly pulled apart the work she had completed during the day. She wove during daylight. She unwove during darkness. For 3 years, this clever plan delayed the suitors. They waited, argued, feasted, and watched the cloth. They never understood why it was taking so long. Eventually, however, one of Penelope's servants revealed the secret. The suitors discovered what she had been doing. They were furious. They demanded that she finish the cloth and make her choice. The palace became more dangerous. Telemachus began to fear that the suitors might kill him. As the son of Odysseus, he was the greatest obstacle between them and the throne of Ithaca. One quiet evening, Telemachus sat among the suitors while they ate and drank. A stranger entered the palace. The stranger appeared to be an old family friend, but in truth, it was the goddess Athena in disguise. Athena had always admired Odysseus. She valued wisdom, courage, planning, and self-control. These were qualities Odysseus possessed, even if he did not always use them wisely. Athena spoke privately with Telemachus. She told him that he could no longer remain silent while the suitors destroyed his home. He needed to search for news of his father. He should sail to the kingdoms of men who had fought beside Odysseus at Troy. Perhaps they knew where he had gone. Perhaps they had heard whether he was still alive. The thought frightened Telemachus. He had never led a voyage. He had never stood before powerful kings. But Athena encouraged him. She reminded him that courage does not always arrive before a journey begins. Sometimes courage appears only after we have taken the first step. The next morning, Telemachus called an assembly of the people of Ithaca. It was the first public assembly held since Odysseus had sailed to Troy. Telemachus stood before the islanders and described what was happening inside the palace. He told them that the suitors were consuming his family's wealth. He asked the people to help him remove them. Some listeners felt ashamed. They knew the suitors were behaving badly, but the suitors' families were powerful, and few people wanted to become involved. The suitors mocked Telemachus. They blamed Penelope for refusing to choose a husband. They claimed they would leave only when she made her decision. Telemachus realized that no one in the assembly would save his home. He would have to begin the journey Athena had suggested. With Athena's secret help, he found a ship and gathered a small crew. That night, while the suitors slept, Telemachus sailed away from Ithaca. The ship moved quietly through the dark water. The island slowly disappeared behind him. For the first time in his life, Telemachus was traveling beyond the world he knew. He visited Nestor, an elderly king who had fought at Troy. Nestor welcomed him kindly, but had little information about Odysseus. He remembered that after Troy fell, The Greek commanders had argued over when and how they should return home. Their fleet had separated. Different groups had sailed in different directions. Nestor had never seen Odysseus again. But he encouraged Telemachus to continue his search. Telemachus then traveled to Sparta. There he met King Menelaus and Queen Helen. The war at Troy had been fought partly because Helen had been taken from Sparta. Now she had returned home, and the great palace seemed peaceful again. Menelaus remembered Odysseus well. He told Telemachus stories about his father's courage and intelligence. He described how Odysseus had entered Troy in disguise to gather information. Helen had recognized him, but she had kept his secret. Menelaus also revealed the most important news Telemachus had heard. During his own voyage home, Menelaus had learned that Odysseus was alive. He was trapped on a distant island, held there by a mysterious goddess. Telemachus finally knew that his father had survived. But the news brought new questions. Where was the island? Why had Odysseus not escaped? Would he ever return? Meanwhile, back in Ithaca, the suitors discovered that Telemachus had sailed away. They were alarmed. The quiet young prince they had mocked was beginning to act like a leader. Some of the suitors planned an ambush. They would hide their ship near the route to Ithaca. When Telemachus returned, they would attack him before he reached the shore. Penelope learned of the plot. She now feared that she might lose both her husband and her son. That night, she lay awake listening to the distant sea. She did not know that far beyond the horizon, the gods had finally decided that Odysseus's wandering should come to an end. Story 2. The Man Lost at Sea. Odysseus was alive. But he was far from home. He had been living for years on the island of Ogygia. It was a beautiful island. Green forests covered the land. Clear water flowed through quiet meadows. Birds nested among the trees. Flowers grew throughout the year. At the center of the island lived the goddess Calypso. Calypso loved Odysseus and wanted him to remain with her forever. She offered him comfort. She offered him protection. She even offered him immortality. If Odysseus stayed, he would never grow old. He would never become weak. He would never die. But Odysseus did not want immortality on a distant island. Every day he walked to the shore and looked across the sea. He thought of Ithaca. He thought of Penelope. He thought of the infant son he had left behind, who must now be almost a grown man. The island was beautiful, but it was not home. One day, the messenger god Hermes arrived on Ogygia. He carried an order from Zeus. Calypso must release Odysseus. His journey had lasted long enough. Calypso was saddened and angered by the command, but she obeyed. She gave Odysseus tools and showed him where to find strong trees. For several days, he cut timber and built a raft. He tied the logs together. He raised a mast. He prepared food and water. Then, after years on the island, Odysseus pushed the raft into the sea. Calypso sent a gentle wind behind him. For many days, he sailed beneath clear skies. He followed the stars and watched the empty horizon. But the god Poseidon had not forgotten him. Long before, Odysseus had harmed Poseidon's son. The sea god still carried his anger. When Poseidon saw Odysseus sailing freely, he gathered the clouds and stirred the water. A storm rose around the small raft. Waves crashed over the logs. The wind tore the sail. The raft broke apart. Odysseus clung to a piece of wood while the sea carried him through the darkness. For 2 days and 2 nights he struggled against the waves. At last, exhausted and nearly unconscious, he reached the shore of an unfamiliar land. He crawled from the water. He found shelter beneath a pile of leaves and fell asleep. The land belonged to the Phaeacians, a people known for their skill with ships. The next morning, a young princess named Nausicaa came to the river near the shore. She and her attendants had brought clothing to wash. While they worked, they played with a ball. Their laughter awakened Odysseus. He stepped from the trees, covered in salt and leaves. The attendants ran away in fear, but Nausicaa remained. Odysseus spoke gently. He did not approach too closely. He asked only for clothing and directions. Nausicaa saw that he was exhausted and alone. She gave him food, clean clothes, and instructions for reaching the palace of her parents. Odysseus followed her advice. King Alcinous and Queen Arete welcomed him as a guest. The Phaeacians did not yet know his name. They gave him a place beside the fire. They offered food and wine. They promised to help him return to his homeland. During a feast, a poet began singing about the war at Troy. Odysseus listened quietly. Then he lowered his head and wept. The memories of the war, the friends he had lost, and the years of wandering became too heavy to hide. King Alcinous noticed. He asked the stranger who he was. He asked where he had traveled and why the Song of Troy caused him so much pain. Odysseus finally revealed his identity. He was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Then, before the gathered Phaeacians, he began telling the story of everything that had happened since he left Troy. When the war ended, Odysseus sailed with 12 ships. His men were tired. They had been away from their homes for 10 years. But the journey began badly. They attacked the land of the Cicones and took treasure from their city. Odysseus ordered his men to return quickly to the ships, but they ignored him. They remained on the shore, eating, drinking, and celebrating. The Cicones gathered reinforcements. At dawn, they attacked. Odysseus and his men barely escaped. Many sailors were killed. The remaining ships returned to the sea, carrying grief instead of celebration. Soon afterward, a powerful wind drove the fleet away from its course. After many difficult days, the ships reached the land of the Lotus Eaters. The people who lived there seemed peaceful. They offered Odysseus's sailors a strange plant called the lotus. Those who ate it forgot their desire to return home. They did not become violent. They did not become ill. They simply lost interest in everything beyond the island. Home no longer mattered. Families became distant memories. The sailors wanted only to remain among the lotus flowers. Odysseus dragged them back to the ships. He tied them beneath the benches until the island disappeared from sight. Then the fleet continued across the sea. Eventually, the ships reached another unfamiliar island. From the shore, Odysseus could see smoke rising from a nearby land. He decided to investigate. Taking one ship and a small group of men, he crossed the water. They entered a large cave. Inside, they found baskets of cheese, containers of milk, and pens filled with sheep and goats. The men urged Odysseus to steal some food and leave. But Odysseus wanted to meet the owner of the cave. He hoped the stranger would follow the ancient custom of hospitality and offer them gifts. So they waited. As evening arrived, a giant returned with his flock. He was a Cyclops, a powerful creature with one enormous eye in the center of his forehead. His name was Polyphemus. He drove the sheep into the cave and rolled a massive stone across the entrance. The stone was so heavy that Odysseus and all his men together could not move it. Polyphemus noticed the strangers. Odysseus explained that they were Greek sailors returning from Troy. He asked the Cyclops to respect the gods and welcome them as guests. Polyphemus laughed. He claimed that Cyclopes did not fear the gods. Then he seized 2 of the men and killed them. The others watched in horror. Odysseus considered attacking Polyphemus while he slept. But if they killed him, no one would be able to move the stone blocking the entrance. They would remain trapped inside the cave. Odysseus needed a different plan. The next day, Polyphemus left with his sheep. He placed the great stone across the entrance again, trapping the Greeks inside. Odysseus found a large wooden staff. He and his men sharpened one end and hardened it in the fire. When Polyphemus returned, Odysseus offered him strong wine. The Cyclops drank deeply. He asked Odysseus for his name. Odysseus replied that his name was Nobody. Polyphemus continued drinking until he fell asleep. Then Odysseus and his men lifted the sharpened staff. Together, they drove it into the Cyclops' single eye. Polyphemus awoke with a terrible cry. Other Cyclopes heard him and gathered outside the cave. They asked who was attacking him. Polyphemus shouted that nobody was hurting him. The other Cyclopes became confused. If nobody was attacking him, they decided, then perhaps his suffering came from the gods. They returned to their homes. Blind and furious, Polyphemus moved the stone from the entrance. He sat beside the opening and touched the backs of his sheep as they walked outside. He expected to catch the Greeks if they tried to escape among the animals, but Odysseus tied each man beneath a sheep. Polyphemus felt only the wool on the animals' backs. One by one, the sheep carried the sailors from the cave. Odysseus escaped beneath the largest ram. The men ran to their ship and pushed away from the shore. They had survived, but Odysseus allowed pride to overcome caution. As the ship moved into deeper water, he shouted back at Polyphemus. He revealed his true name. He wanted the Cyclops to know that Odysseus had defeated him. Polyphemus lifted his hands toward the sky. He called upon his father, Poseidon. He asked the god of the sea to punish Odysseus. If Odysseus was destined to return home, Polyphemus prayed, then let the journey be long and painful. Let him lose his ships, let him lose his companions, and let him return to Ithaca alone. Poseidon heard the prayer. From that moment onward, the sea itself seemed determined to keep Odysseus from home. The remaining ships later reached the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus kindly. For an entire month, he listened to stories about Troy. When Odysseus prepared to leave, Aeolus gave him a remarkable gift. He placed every dangerous wind inside a strong leather bag. Only the gentle west wind remained free. That wind would carry the ships directly toward Ithaca. For 9 days, Odysseus sailed without sleeping. He watched the sails. He guided the fleet. On the 10th day, the hills of Ithaca appeared in the distance. They were so close that the sailors could see fires burning along the shore. Odysseus could no longer keep his eyes open. He lay down and fell asleep. The sailors noticed the leather bag. They believed Aeolus had filled it with gold and silver. They thought Odysseus was secretly keeping treasure for himself. While he slept, they opened the bag. All the imprisoned winds escaped at once. A violent storm seized the ships. The coastline of Ithaca disappeared. The fleet was carried all the way back to the island of Aeolus. Odysseus begged for help again. But Aeolus refused. He believed that someone suffering such terrible misfortune must be hated by the gods. The ships sailed away without protection. They traveled until they reached the land of the Laestrygonians. The harbor there was surrounded by steep cliffs. 11 of the 12 ships entered the narrow bay. Odysseus, feeling uneasy, kept his own ship outside. The Laestrygonians were enormous and violent. They attacked from the cliffs, throwing heavy rocks down upon the ships. The narrow harbor became a trap. 11 ships were destroyed. Only the vessel commanded by Odysseus escaped. Hundreds of men had begun the journey from Troy. Now only one ship remained. The survivors eventually reached a forested island called Aea. The island belonged to the enchantress Circe. Odysseus divided his remaining crew into 2 groups. One group stayed beside the ship. The other explored the island. The explorers found Circe's palace in a clearing. Strange but peaceful animals wandered outside. Wolves and lions approached the men without attacking. Circe welcomed the sailors into her hall. She gave them food mixed with a magical potion. When they had eaten, she touched them with a wand. The men were transformed into pigs. Only one sailor escaped. He ran back to the ship and told Odysseus what had happened. Odysseus took his sword and started toward the palace. On the path, the god Hermes appeared. Hermes gave Odysseus a magical herb that would protect him from Circe's potion. He also told Odysseus how to defeat her spell. Circe welcomed Odysseus and offered him the same enchanted food. Odysseus ate, but the magic had no effect. When Circe raised her wand, Odysseus drew his sword. Surprised, she surrendered. She restored the sailors to human form. Afterward, Circe became their host. Odysseus and his men remained on the island for an entire year. They ate well. They rested. Their clothing was repaired. Their strength returned. For a time, the hardships of the journey seemed far away. But eventually, the sailors reminded Odysseus of Ithaca. They had not survived storms and monsters simply to forget their homes. Odysseus asked Circe how they could continue safely. Her answer was unsettling. Before sailing farther, Odysseus needed to visit the land of the dead. There he must speak with the spirit of the prophet Tiresias. Only Tiresias could tell him how to reach Ithaca. Circe explained the journey. Odysseus and his companions sailed to the edge of the known world. The sky grew darker. Mist covered the sea. They reached a silent shore where sunlight rarely appeared. Odysseus performed the ritual Circe had described. The spirits of the dead gathered around him. Among them was Elpenor, one of his own sailors. Elpenor had died accidentally on Circe's island just before the crew departed. In their hurry, the men had not realized what had happened. Elpenor begged Odysseus to return and give him a proper burial. Odysseus promised that he would. Then the prophet Tiresias appeared. He warned Odysseus that Poseidon still opposed him, but there was a path home. The sailors would reach an island where the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios lived. No matter how hungry they became, they must not harm those animals. If they left the cattle untouched, they might all return home. If they killed them, the ship and crew would be destroyed. Odysseus would survive, but he would reach Ithaca late, alone, and in great suffering. Tiresias also warned him about what waited in Ithaca. Men were consuming his wealth and seeking to marry Penelope. Odysseus would need patience when he returned. Among the spirits, Odysseus saw his mother. When he left Ithaca, she had been alive. Now she was among the dead. She told him that Penelope still waited. Telemachus was growing into a man. Laertes, Odysseus's father, lived sadly in the countryside. His mother had not died from illness or violence. She had died from grief and longing for her absent son. Odysseus tried to embrace her. 3 times he reached toward her. 3 times his arms passed through empty air. The spirits of warriors from Troy also appeared. Odysseus spoke with Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek army. Agamemnon had survived the war and reached his kingdom, only to be murdered inside his own home. He warned Odysseus to return carefully. Achilles also appeared. During the war, Achilles had been the greatest of the Greek warriors. Songs celebrated his glory. But in the land of the dead, Achilles no longer cared about fame. He asked only about his father and his son. Odysseus comforted him by describing the bravery of his son, Neoptolemus. At last, surrounded by countless spirits, Odysseus returned to his ship. He and his crew sailed back to Circe's island. They buried Elpenor. Then Circe gave Odysseus final instructions for the dangers ahead. The first danger would be the sirens. The sirens sang from an island surrounded by bones and broken ships. Their voices promised knowledge. They seemed to understand the secret desires of every traveler who heard them. Sailors turned their ships toward the music and never returned. Circe advised Odysseus to fill his crew's ears with wax. But Odysseus wanted to hear the song. So he ordered his men to tie him tightly to the mast. No matter what he said or how desperately he begged, they must not release him until the island was far behind them. As the ship approached the sirens, the sea became strangely calm. The sailors placed wax in their ears. They tied Odysseus to the mast. Then, The singing began. The voices called to him. They promised to reveal every hidden truth. They sang of Troy. They sang of the future. They made Odysseus believe that turning toward their island was the most important thing he could ever do. He struggled against the ropes. He shouted at his men to free him, but the sailors could not hear. They continued rowing. The voices slowly faded. When the island had disappeared, the crew removed the wax and released Odysseus. Another danger waited ahead. The ship had to pass through a narrow channel. On one side was Charybdis, a monstrous force beneath the sea that swallowed enormous amounts of water. On the other side lived Scylla, a creature hidden inside a cliff. Circe had warned Odysseus that there was no completely safe path. If he sailed too close to Charybdis, the entire ship might be destroyed. If he sailed near Scylla, some men would be taken, but the ship might escape. Odysseus chose the path near Scylla. He did not tell the crew exactly what would happen. He feared they might stop rowing. As they passed beneath the cliff, Scylla reached from her cave. 6 sailors were pulled from the deck. The others rowed desperately until the ship entered open water. Odysseus later remembered this as one of the most painful moments of the journey. He had faced enemies in battle. He had watched storms destroy ships. But near Scylla, he had known that some of his men would die, and he had been unable to save them. The survivors soon reached the island of the sun god. Sacred cattle grazed peacefully in the fields. Odysseus reminded his sailors of the warning from Tiresias. They could rest on the island, but they must not harm the cattle. At first, the men obeyed. Then, unfavorable winds trapped the ship. Days passed. Their food disappeared. The sailors began to starve. Odysseus prayed for help, but one day he fell into a deep sleep. While he slept, a sailor named Eurylochus spoke to the others. He argued that starvation was a terrible way to die. It would be better to kill the cattle, eat, and later build a temple to Helios as an apology. The hungry men agreed. They killed several of the sacred animals. When Odysseus awoke and smelled the cooking meat, he knew their fate had been decided. Once the wind changed, they returned to the sea. Zeus gathered a storm. A lightning bolt struck the ship. The mast broke. The vessel shattered. Every sailor was swept into the waves. Only Odysseus survived. He tied pieces of broken wood together and drifted alone. The sea carried him back toward Charybdis. He escaped by clinging to the branches of a tree above the water until pieces of the wreckage returned to the surface. Then he continued drifting. After many days, he reached the island of Calypso. There he remained until the gods finally ordered his release. When Odysseus finished telling his story, the hall of the Phaeacians was silent. The listeners understood that the stranger before them had lost everything except his desire to return home. King Alcinous ordered his sailors to prepare their finest ship. The Phaeacians placed gifts on board. They gave Odysseus warm blankets and allowed him to rest beneath the deck. The ship sailed faster than any ordinary vessel. Odysseus slept throughout the journey. At last, the Phaeacians reached Ithaca. They carried the sleeping traveler onto the shore. They placed his gifts beside him. Then they sailed away. After 20 years of war and wandering, Odysseus was home. But when he awakened, he did not recognize the island. Athena had covered the landscape in mist. Odysseus feared that the Phaeacians had abandoned him in some foreign country. Then Athena appeared. She removed the mist. The hills of Ithaca emerged. The familiar harbor appeared. Odysseus touched the ground. He had returned, but his journey was not yet finished. Story 3. The King in Disguise. Athena warned Odysseus about the suitors. If he entered the palace openly, they would attack him. He needed to learn who remained loyal and who had betrayed his household. Athena changed his appearance. His skin became wrinkled. His hair became thin and gray. His fine clothing became old and torn. To anyone who saw him, Odysseus appeared to be an elderly beggar. Athena told him to visit Eumaeus, a swineherd who had served the royal family for many years. Eumaeus lived in a simple hut away from the palace. He did not recognize the stranger, but he welcomed him. He offered food, shelter, and a place beside the fire. Eumaeus spoke sadly about Odysseus. He believed his king was probably dead, but he had never stopped respecting him. He complained about the suitors and worried about Telemachus. Odysseus listened carefully. He was deeply moved by the servant's loyalty, but he did not reveal his identity. Instead, he told Eumaeus an invented story about his travels. He claimed to have heard that Odysseus was still alive and would soon return. Eumaeus wanted to believe him, but too many travelers had brought false stories to Penelope. Meanwhile, Athena traveled to Sparta. She appeared to Telemachus in a dream and told him to return home immediately. She warned him about the suitors' ambush. Telemachus left before sunrise. His ship avoided the place where the suitors were waiting. When he reached Ithaca, he sent the ship and crew toward the city. Telemachus himself traveled secretly to the hut of Eumaeus. The swineherd greeted him with joy. To Eumaeus, Telemachus was almost like a son. Inside the hut, Telemachus saw the old beggar. He did not recognize his father. Eumaeus left to carry news of Telemachus's safe return to Penelope. When he was gone, Athena appeared outside. She restored Odysseus's true appearance. His back straightened. His clothing became clean. His face looked strong again. Telemachus stared at him in amazement. He believed the stranger must be a god. Odysseus told him the truth. He was not a god. He was his father. Telemachus struggled to believe him. His father had been absent for almost his entire life. But as Odysseus spoke, Telemachus understood. Father and son embraced. For a long time, neither could speak. Years of absence, questions, anger, hope, and grief passed between them. Then they began planning. Odysseus asked how many suitors were inside the palace. Telemachus explained that there were too many for two men to fight openly, but Odysseus trusted Athena. He told Telemachus to return to the palace. The next day, Odysseus would arrive disguised as a beggar. Telemachus must not reveal his identity. Together, they would remove the weapons hanging from the great hall. When the time came, only a small number of loyal people would stand with them. Telemachus returned to the palace. Penelope rushed toward him. She was relieved that he had survived. The suitors were surprised and disappointed. Their ambush had failed. They pretended to welcome him, but Telemachus now understood their intentions. The following day, Eumaeus guided the disguised Odysseus toward the palace. As they approached, Odysseus saw familiar fields, roads, and fountains. Every part of Ithaca carried a memory. Near the palace gate lay an old dog. His name was Argos. Many years earlier, Odysseus had trained him as a hunting dog. Now Argos was old and neglected. He lay on the ground, too weak to move. But when Odysseus approached, Argos lifted his head. He recognized his master. His tail moved slightly. Odysseus turned his face away so Eumaeus would not see his tears. He could not speak to the dog without revealing himself. After seeing Odysseus one final time, Argos closed his eyes and died. Inside the palace, the suitors continued their feast. Odysseus entered as a beggar and moved quietly among them. Some gave him food. Others mocked him. One of the most arrogant suitors, Antinous, threw a stool and struck him. Odysseus controlled his anger. This was not yet the time to act. He watched. He listened. He learned which servants remained loyal. He also discovered which servants had joined the suitors. Penelope heard that a strange traveler had arrived. She was told that he might have information about Odysseus. She asked to speak with him. That evening, the disguised king sat across from his wife. 20 years had changed them both. Penelope looked tired, but her intelligence and dignity remained. Odysseus wanted to reveal himself, but the danger inside the palace was still too great, so he continued his disguise. Penelope asked whether he had ever met Odysseus. The stranger described clothing that Odysseus had worn many years earlier. The details were so accurate that Penelope began to weep. Odysseus told her that her husband was alive. He claimed Odysseus would return soon. Penelope had heard similar promises before. She wanted to believe him, but hope had disappointed her many times. She ordered an elderly servant named Euryclea to wash the stranger's feet. Euryclea had cared for Odysseus when he was a child. As she washed his legs, she noticed an old scar above his knee. Odysseus had received the scar during a hunting accident when he was young. Euryclea recognized it immediately. She looked into his face. Odysseus placed a finger to his lips. He warned her not to reveal him. Euryclea could barely contain her joy, but she obeyed. Before leaving, Penelope told the stranger about a dream. In the dream, an eagle had killed a group of geese inside her home. The eagle then spoke with the voice of Odysseus. It said that the geese represented the suitors, and that their time had ended. Penelope did not know whether the dream was a true message or simply another expression of her hopes. She had decided to create a final contest. Odysseus had once owned a powerful bow. It was so difficult to bend that few men could string it. Penelope would bring the bow before the suitors. She would marry the man who could string it and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. The disguised Odysseus listened. He told her that the contest should not be delayed. The man she was waiting for was already near. Love, Story 4. The Bow, the Bed, and the Return of Peace. The next morning, the palace hall was prepared for the contest. Penelope entered carrying the bow of Odysseus. For a moment, she held it quietly. The bow reminded her of the husband she had lost and the life that had existed before the war. Then she placed it before the suitors. The axes were arranged in a straight line. The suitors stepped forward one by one. Each man believed the contest would be easy. They had spent years eating Odysseus's food and imagining themselves upon his throne. But the bow would not bend for them. Some pulled until their hands hurt. Others warmed the wood near the fire. They covered it with oil. Still, none could string it. Antinous suggested that they pause and continue the following day. The disguised Odysseus asked for a chance to try. The suitors laughed. They said a poor old beggar had no right to touch the weapon. Penelope replied that allowing him to try would do no harm, but Telemachus intervened. He told his mother that he would manage the contest. Penelope looked at her son. Something in his voice had changed. He no longer sounded like the uncertain boy who had once remained silent before the suitors. He sounded like a prince of Ithaca. Penelope returned to her rooms. Telemachus ordered that the bow be given to the beggar. Eumaeus placed it in Odysseus's hands. Odysseus examined the weapon carefully. He turned it over. He tested the wood and string. Then, without great effort, he bent the bow and strung it. The room became silent. Odysseus selected an arrow. He aimed. The arrow passed cleanly through all 12 axe heads. A sound of distant thunder rolled across the sky. Telemachus moved to his father's side. Odysseus removed the clothing of the beggar. He stood before the suitors and revealed his identity. He was Odysseus. He had returned to his home. The doors of the hall were closed. The weapons that once hung along the walls had been removed. The suitors suddenly understood that they were trapped. Antinous reached for a cup, but Odysseus released an arrow. Antinous fell. The other suitors panicked. Some believed Odysseus had killed him accidentally. Then Odysseus spoke. He described how they had occupied his palace. They had consumed his wealth. They had insulted his family. They had planned to kill his son. Now they would answer for their actions. One suitor tried to blame everything on Antinous. He offered to repay the stolen wealth. Odysseus refused. The battle began. Telemachus stood beside his father. Eumaeus and another loyal servant joined them. Athena watched over the hall. The suitors searched for weapons, but most had already been hidden. Some fought desperately. Others attempted to escape. The struggle continued until the last of the suitors had fallen. The great hall became quiet. Odysseus ordered the servants to clean the room. Those who had betrayed the household were punished. Those who had remained loyal were protected. Euryclea hurried to Penelope's room. She announced that Odysseus had returned. Penelope did not believe her. For years, travelers had arrived with stories. Dreams had promised his return. Every distant sail had brought hope and disappointment. She feared that this might be another deception. Euryclea described the scar she had seen. Still, Penelope remained cautious. She walked into the hall. Odysseus stood before her. But after 20 years, he looked both familiar and strange. Penelope sat across from him without speaking. Telemachus became frustrated. He could not understand why his mother did not immediately embrace his father. But Penelope needed certainty. She had survived the suitors through patience and careful thinking. She would not abandon that caution now. Odysseus was given clean clothing. Athena restored strength and youthfulness to his appearance. When he returned, Penelope ordered a servant to move their marriage bed from the bedroom and prepare it elsewhere. Odysseus reacted immediately. He said the bed could not be moved. Years earlier, he had built the bedroom around a living olive tree. He had shaped the trunk into one of the bedposts. The bed was rooted to the earth. Only someone who knew its secret could understand that it could never be carried from the room. Penelope finally knew the truth. The secret of the bed belonged only to the two of them. She ran toward Odysseus. After 20 years, husband and wife embraced. They spoke through the night. Odysseus told her about the islands he had visited. He told her about the Cyclops, Circe, the land of the dead, the Sirens, Calypso, and the Phaeacians. Penelope told him about the years of waiting. She described the suitors and the weaving trick. She told him about Telemachus growing from a baby into a man. There was too much to tell in a single night. Yet, for the first time in many years, there was no need to hurry. Odysseus was home. The following morning, Odysseus left the palace to visit his father, Laertes. The old man lived in the countryside. He wore simple clothing and worked among the trees. Grief had changed him. When Odysseus approached, he did not immediately reveal himself. Perhaps years of wandering had made disguise and caution difficult habits to abandon. He told Laertes another invented story. But when he saw how deeply his father mourned, Odysseus could not continue. He revealed the scar on his leg. He described the trees Laertes had given him when he was a child. He named each pear tree, apple tree, fig tree, and vine. Laertes recognized his son. The old man embraced him. For a brief time, the family of Odysseus was whole again. But news of the suitors' deaths spread across Ithaca. Their relatives gathered weapons. They wanted revenge. The island seemed ready to enter another cycle of violence. Odysseus, Telemachus, Laertes, and their loyal companions prepared to defend themselves. The two sides met outside the city. Before the fighting could continue, Athena intervened. She ordered the people of Ithaca to make peace. Zeus sent a sign from the sky. The anger that had filled the island began to fade. The families lowered their weapons. Odysseus was restored as king. Telemachus stood beside him, no longer the uncertain child who had waited for a father he could barely remember. Penelope returned to the quiet management of her household. Laertes knew that his son had survived, and the palace of Ithaca, which had been filled for years with arguments, feasting, and fear, became peaceful again. Odysseus had traveled across an enormous world. He had entered palaces and caves. He had spoken with kings, gods, monsters, and spirits. He had been offered treasure, comfort, and immortality. But none of those things had replaced his desire for home. The journey had taught him that cleverness could save a life. It had also taught him that pride could place a life in danger. His intelligence had defeated the Cyclops. His pride had caused him to reveal his name. His planning had allowed him to escape many enemies. His curiosity had repeatedly pulled him toward danger. Like many ancient heroes, Odysseus was not perfect. He survived partly because of his strengths, and partly because he slowly learned to control his weaknesses. Penelope had also completed a kind of Odyssey. She did not cross dangerous seas. She did not fight monsters. But for 20 years, she protected her home through patience. Her weaving became its own kind of battle. Every thread delayed the suitors. Every night of unweaving gave Telemachus more time to grow. Telemachus traveled another road. His journey was the movement from childhood into adulthood. At first, he waited for others to solve the problems inside his home. Then he sailed beyond Ithaca. He spoke before kings. He escaped an ambush. And when Odysseus returned, Telemachus was ready to stand beside him. Perhaps this is why the story has survived for so long. It is not only a story about monsters and gods, it is a story about waiting. It is a story about becoming someone new while trying to return to something old. Odysseus dreamed of coming home to the life he had left. But the Ithaca he returned to was different. Penelope had changed. Telemachus had grown. His parents had aged. Many old friends were gone. Even Odysseus himself was no longer the man who had sailed to Troy. Homecoming did not mean traveling backward in time. It meant accepting the years that had passed. It meant meeting familiar people again and discovering who they had become. It meant rebuilding peace after a long absence. And now, our own journey across the ancient sea is nearly finished. The palace lights of Ithaca glow softly in the distance. The ships have been pulled onto the shore. The oars are resting. The sails have been lowered. Across the hills, olive branches move gently in the night wind. Inside the palace, Penelope and Odysseus are together. Telemachus sleeps safely beneath the same roof. The sea that kept the king away for so many years is quiet at last. You may allow your thoughts to become quiet as well. There are no more storms to cross tonight. No more monsters waiting beyond the horizon. Nothing is chasing you. Nothing requires your attention. Let your breathing settle into its own gentle rhythm. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out. Imagine the dark water becoming smooth. Imagine the stars reflected across its surface. Each small wave carries you closer to rest. The story is ending, but you do not need to follow it any farther. The road is complete. The traveler has returned. The doors of the palace are closed against the night. The fire burns quietly in the hall, and somewhere beyond the olive trees, the sea continues its slow and endless song. Good night. Sleep peacefully, and may every long road eventually lead you home.